yeah, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what Labour needs to do as regards the banks. So I'll start with a little story. Before 2007, the last time there was a run on a British bank, it was 1866. The Austro-Hungarian Empire still existed, and the USA had just freed the slaves. That was the last time there was a run on a British bank before 2007. Overend Gurney and Company, the banker's bank, collapsed in the wake of the bubble around the UK's railways. And this created the panic of 1866 because the Bank of England refused to step in and bail out Overend and Gurney Company in the spirit of laissez-faire capitalism, according to which it's very important to let the market decide which companies win and which fall. 150 years later, we found ourselves in a very, very different scenario with the collapse of Northern Rock. You saw very similar sorts of things. Northern Rock was also overexposed to a particular bubble, this time in the housing market. It had also massively exposed itself via the interbank lending markets, and so the way it raised its funding meant that as soon as there was even a small sense of panic in financial markets, it completely lost access to any form of funding, and there was a run on Northern Rock. But this time, the Bank of England did step in to help. And it didn't just step in to help Northern Rock, it stepped in to provide billions and billions of pounds worth of taxpayers' money to bail out the entire financial system. In fact, the global financial system, along with the Fed, the Bank of England, supported the bailout of banks all over the world. So what happened? What changed over 150 years to make the Bank of England, one of the UK's oldest institutions, change its mind and decide that actually every now and again you do need to bail banks out? And this essentially comes down to the financialisation of the UK economy. Had the Bank of England allowed Northern Rock to fail, many other UK banks would have failed, and that wouldn't have just led to a kind of deep economic recession as it did in 1866. It would have broken the fabric, the lubricant of the British economy. And households, businesses, every economic actor would have found themselves completely unable to function. And this has been a process of financialisation, whereby ordinary people, ordinary businesses have become much, much more implicated in the functioning of financial markets. And there's a way of demonstrating it. If you just take Keynes's breakdown of the economy, so Keynes sees kind of aggregate demand as composed of consumption by households, investment by businesses, spending by government, and imports and exports. You can see the way in which each of these different aspects of the economy has become more and more implicated in financial markets over the last 30 years. So with households, we've seen since the deregulation of banks in the 1980s, dramatic increases in household debt. Household debt's risen from about 80% of disposable incomes in 1970 to over 150% before the financial crisis. And most of that debt has been fueled into the purchase of housing. And this has driven house prices up because, of course, as any kind of monetarist will tell you, when you direct lots of money, when you have more money chasing the same amount of stuff, it pushes up prices. And this is what's happened with house prices and asset prices throughout the economy due to the proliferation of private debt. And of course, this has been a particularly ingenious model because it's been able to disguise massive falls in people's wages, a big gap that's opened up between productivity and wages. People haven't noticed over the last 30 years that their wages have actually fallen, and in many ways their disposable incomes have stagnated because we've had this asset effect of the increasing value of their homes, people being able to gain better access to credit, and those homes going up in price. You can see it when it comes to firms. So firms have become much more implicated in financial markets than they ever have been in history. And this has led to the rise of the idea that it's the only responsibility of firms is to maximise shareholder value. So rather than paying their workers properly, rather than investing in future production, the most important thing they can do is make sure that their shareholders, i.e. some of the richest people in society, are able to extract as much wealth from the production process as conceivably possible. And you see this with firms paying out much higher dividends, so that's the kind of returns they give to investors, relative to wages, relative to investment over the last 30 years than ever before in history. You can see it when it comes to the state. So the collapse of Carillion recently was a very good example of what happens when the state becomes involved in private financial markets. Rather than providing many of these services themselves, the state decided that it was going to try and access private financing to deliver our infrastructure and many of our frontline public services. And in doing so, it created an oligopoly of firms that were able to kind of extract basically economic rents from being able to situate themselves between the state and the market. And perhaps the best way, of course, in which the state's become financialised is the fact that it, still owns shares in one of the UK's largest banks. And all of this has been funded by that last part of the Keynesian equation, that imports and exports. Because none of this would have been possible were it not for capital inflows from the rest of the world into the City of London, which has sustained a massive increase. It's essentially since the 1980s, because the banks have been able to lend more and because capital has been flowing into the UK, into the City of London and the rest of the world, it's almost as though this country has been showered with free money. And this has had a very interesting effect on our politics, of course. But all of this collapsed in 2007. And there are a number of, Adam Tooze has just written a 600-page book on the financial crisis, so I won't try and explain everything that happened in one short talk. But essentially, the contradictions that underlay that model were the fact that you can't base an economy around continuous increases in debt that drive continuous increases in asset prices to increase continuously consumption in the absence of any real wage growth, in the absence of any expansion in the productive base of the economy. And so obviously this model collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions in 2007. And since then, we've really failed to move on to anything new, and this has economists incredibly puzzled. They're coming up with all sorts of names for the state we find ourselves in today. It's secular stagnation, the problem is high public debt, and we need to implement austerity. Whereas actually, the problem is fairly obvious, and it dates back to when all our economic troubles started, 2007. It's this overhang of private debt. It's the overhang of debt in our companies. And it's the fact that rather than supporting ordinary people and helping them pay down their debts, the government decided to step in and support the banks, step in defence of creditors all over the world, which has left this economy with this massive debt overhang that's preventing people from spending. It's led to, so this year, for the first time since the Lawson boom in the 1980s, people's outgoings exceeded their incomings. And we're living now in a really fundamentally unhealthy economy, a zombie economy, in which the old debt hasn't been written off, but people are too indebted to be able to take out any more. And so all this requires a complete and utter transformation in the way our economy works. And the thinking that's coming out of the Labour Party, as Ed mentioned, is one massive step in that direction, in the right direction. But one of the main things that's missing is how we're planning on taking on the banks, how we're planning on taking on our finance sector, how we're planning on definancialising not just our financial system, but our entire economy. And this is something of a gap in Labour's thinking, I think, perhaps because we're a bit scared of the city. We're scared of there being this Mitterrand moment as what happened to the French president in the 1980s, where the banks decided we don't really like socialism very much, we're taking all our money away. But I would argue that actually, when the last time that there was any kind of similar transformation in the economy, it was the 1980s, and it was Margaret Thatcher who was deciding that she was going to solve the crisis through which our economy was kind of dragging itself by creating this model of finance, of the growth of the finance sector, of debt-fueled consumption, of asset price inflation. She'd allow everyone to buy their own home. She'd create a class of mini-capitalists that wouldn't notice that they were being extremely exploited by the people they were working for because their houses were increasing in value and they could get access to credit cards. And the way she did this, she didn't just say, I'm going to deregulate the banks. She didn't just say, I'm going to implement right to buy. She also knew that economics fundamentally stems out of politics. That you can't build a new economy if the power relations that supported the old one still exist. So what did she do? She broke the unions. And this was the first thing that Thatcher did as soon as she got into office. She'd been planning it. As soon as she became leader of the Tory party, there's something called the Ridley Report that shows that what happened in the 1980s with regards to the miners' strike was a preconceived plan that Thatcher had to bring down each and every one of the UK's unions one by one to make sure that nothing stood in her way, to make sure that politics would not get in the way of her economic strategy. And I think, controversially, that Labour needs to think today about the banks in the same way that Thatcher thought about the unions. So obviously we don't want to create the kind of crisis that Thatcher created in the 80s. we don't want a massive slowdown in economic growth as a result of what we do when we come into power with regards to the finance sector. So this means that we need to implement policies that simultaneously boost people's standards of living and take power away from financial capital and bring it back to ordinary people, to working people, so we can build an economy that works in the interest of those who live off work rather than those that live off wealth. And you'll have to buy my book next year if you want to hear all the recommendations that I have about that. But a couple that stand out to me the most today are that we should start by writing off unsecured consumer debt. So it would be very easy for the Bank of England to intervene in the economy to buy up a lot of the unsecured consumer debt. It's credit card debt, it's debt not backed up by an asset. To buy up some of that debt, force the banks to take a haircut on it and just write some of it off. It'd be the equivalent of giving people a massive boost in their purchasing power without really doing, without really doing anything on a grand economic scale. All you'd have to do is impose some losses on banks that we've been supporting with billions of pounds of UK taxpayers' money since 2007. So firstly, it writes off unsecured consumer debt. It both improves people's standards of living, helps boost the economy, and also helps redistribute power away from financial capital towards ordinary people. The second thing we need to do is cut off the bank's lifeblood, is curb capital flows. And this is not just a mechanism to prevent the banks from continuously growing, from providing more and more debt. It's actually to stop them doing the illegal things that they have thrived off over the last 40 years, whether that's promoting tax evasion, whether that's HSBC being involved in some of its branches in laundering money for Mexican drug cartels, and that money floating off into the abyss of the international financial system with no way of ever really imposing any accountability or following it, to make sure that these people can be held to account. So curbing capital flows is important both to kind of bring our finance sector into line and also to actually make it subject to democratic accountability and the rule of law. Thirdly, we need to break up the universal banking model. So for a long time we've had commercial and investment banking smushed together in these massive mega banks, which mean that ordinary people's savings are exposed on financial markets. And alongside that, we need to bring back new models of banking, which means, reviving the credit unions, bring back building societies, all these sorts of forms of mutual ownership that are really based on this kind of intergenerational pact whereby you save and you're able to borrow in different points in your life, rather than saying, save now and the banks will invest all your money in financial markets and maybe if you don't have an economic crash, you'll get it back in 30 years. Finally, we need to strengthen and properly enforce competition law with regards to our banks. But finally, we also need to make sure that the Bank of England fills in any of the gaps that still remain after we've rebuilt our credit unions and public banking, to make sure that it's actually fulfilling its role with regards to ordinary people. Because at the moment, we've had this independent Bank of England for a very, very long time. And there's a really a very interesting quote back from the 1980s where the governor of the Bank of England said that when it was making monetary policy, it was a small price to pay to have unemployment in the north to protect inflation in the City of London in the south. So this idea that we've got an independent Bank of England that's making technocratic, apolitical decisions is completely ridiculous. In fact, the Bank of England and the Citibank Treasury nexus that exists around it has implemented policy decisions that have supported our finance sector against the interests of ordinary people in many other parts of the country for many, many years. And we really need to transform that model. And that does mean institutional change. It means subjecting the Bank of England to democratic accountability, but it also means making sure that rather than providing huge amounts of money to our unaccountable banks, that actually the Bank of England is providing money for productive economic activity in the real economy. And so longer term, you need to also do all the other things that are present in the Labour Party's manifesto. Reform models of ownership, have an industrial strategy, everything Jeremy Corbyn was talking about with regards to build it in Britain, to rebalance financial activity, to rebalance economic activity away from finance towards productive investment. But one thing I would say is that in order to get there, we need to make sure that we treat the banks the way Thatcher treated the unions. And just like she broke the unions, we need to make sure we break the banks.